The Lands Between is full of things that want to kill you. Trolls, dragons, knights wrapped in gold leaf and grief. Those are easy to understand. You see a boss health bar, you know what you're dealing with, you either die to it 40 times or you don't. That's not what this video is about. This is about the creatures that don't announce themselves. The ones tucked into the corner of a swamp or buried under a line of item text you'd only read if you were desperate for lore. The ones that were clearly designed with a level of care that vastly outweighs how much screen time they get, which is usually the first sign that something's actually wrong with them. From Software doesn't waste detail. If a background enemy has an entire skeletal structure modeled underneath rotting flesh that the camera will never zoom in on, somebody made a decision to put that there. Somebody thought about it. That should worry you more than any boss fight ever could. We're not doing a top 10 countdown of things that look scary in a promotional trailer. We're doing something slower. We're going to sit with a handful of the Lands Between's least explained horrors, the ones that raise more questions than they answer, and we're going to try to figure out what the game is actually telling us, if it's telling us anything at all. Some of these you've fought 100 times without knowing what you were looking at. Some you've probably never triggered. All of them share one thing in common: the horror isn't in the design. It's in the gap. It's in what the game refuses to say. Let's start with the one that broke a good chunk of the fanbase's brain when it was finally pieced together. Godwin. You know the name if you've spent any time at all in the Lands Between. Godwin the Golden, first of the demigods to die. The one whose death cracked the Elden Ring and kicked off the entire Shattering. Every NPC with a pulse brings him up eventually. He's treated like a legend, like a tragedy, like the one death that actually mattered among a family of people who mostly deserved what was coming to them. What the game does not do, at any point, in any straightforward way, is show you what actually happened to his body. Here's the detail that unravels the whole thing once you notice it. Godwin didn't die in the conventional sense. He was killed in a way that specifically stripped him of the destined death, the one true death granted by the rune of death itself, which means his body kept living in some form even after the killing blow landed. His soul, or whatever you want to call the animating force of a demigod, didn't get to leave. It stayed. And what it stayed inside of is not a golden, dignified corpse laid out in some royal tomb. It's a rotted, twisted, submerged thing. A body transfigured by rot and repurposed by the Golden Order into something they needed for the ending mechanics of the entire game, whether or not you ever consciously notice it. Player theorizing has spent years trying to pin down the exact shape this transformation takes, because the game never gives you a clean cutscene explaining it. What it gives you instead is scattered evidence. Item descriptions that mention a serpent. Boss placements that don't quite make sense until you cross-reference them with dialogue from unrelated NPCs. The fact that certain late-game questlines involve interacting with something that is clearly meant to be Godwin, clearly connected to him, and yet never once uses his name in a way that confirms it outright. That ambiguity isn't a writing failure. It's deliberate obfuscation, and the reason it's unsettling is that the game wants you to arrive at the horror yourself instead of being told it. Think about what that implies if you take it seriously for a second. A demigod, one of the most powerful beings in the setting, was killed in a way that specifically denied him the mercy of actually dying. He didn't get an ending, he got converted. His body became infrastructure, something the Golden Order could point to, use, and quietly avoid discussing in polite company, the way you'd avoid discussing what's really happening in the walls of a house everyone insists is haunted. The horror of Godwin isn't a jump scare. It's the horror of realizing that someone you were told to mourn as a tragic hero was actually repurposed as a tool. And the people who did it never had to answer for it, because nobody in the story is willing to say what happened out loud. What makes this worse, if you sit with it long enough, is thinking about the timescale involved. The Shattering, the war that fractures the Lands Between and sets the entire game's events in motion, doesn't happen the instant Godwin dies. Years pass, possibly decades. Depending on how you read the chronology, the game scatters across its item descriptions and background dialogue. That means whatever Godwin became, he was becoming it for a very long time before you ever arrive. Not a single transformation, a slow one, a process with stages, playing out somewhere the story never lets you see directly. While every other character in the setting was busy fighting wars over runes and thrones, and treated his name as a rallying cry instead of a body still, in some sense in the process of changing. Nobody went looking for him. Nobody, as far as the text ever confirms, went to check. That absence of anyone checking is its own quiet detail worth dwelling on. Godwin had siblings. He had a father who ruled the entire lands between, and presumably had the resources to investigate what happened to his own son's remains. And yet the game gives you no indication that anyone with that kind of power ever went looking, or if they did, that they found anything they were willing to talk about afterward. Either nobody looked, which says something bleak about how quickly even demigods get reduced to symbols once they're useful as one, or somebody looked and decided silence was easier than an answer. Neither option is comforting. Both are consistent with everything else this game refuses to resolve. That refusal to name things directly is a pattern you'll notice again and again if you start looking for it. It shows up in a much smaller, much stranger family of creatures next, the finger creepers. If you've played more than a handful of hours, you've seen them. Pale, spindly things that skitter across ceilings and walls, usually in caves or ruins, usually in groups. They're unsettling on a purely mechanical level, because horror games have trained us for decades to be afraid of anything that moves in a way a human body shouldn't. But the actual horror of the finger creepers isn't their movement, it's their origin, and their origin is one of the more quietly disturbing implications in the entire game once you connect the dots. The clue is in the name, and it's not subtle once you know what to look for. Fingers, as in the two fingers, the small deified beings who select and empower the tarnished throughout the story. The two fingers are themselves described in unsettling terms, more like grown things than born things, closer to fungal or vegetal growths than anything resembling a conventional creature. The theory, and it's a theory that's gained enough traction to be treated as close to canon by a large chunk of the lore community, is that finger creepers are essentially failed attempts. Rejected vessels. Things that were meant to grow into something like the two fingers, or meant to serve a similar divine function, and simply didn't take. What's left skittering around in the dark isn't a monster in the traditional sense. It's a miscarriage given legs. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's not there for shock value. It's there because it's the most accurate way to describe what the item descriptions and environmental placement are gesturing toward. These aren't creatures that were born and grew wrong. They're creatures that were being made, deliberately, by something with intention, and the process failed partway through. Whatever process the two fingers used to elevate a being into something powerful enough to select and guide a tarnished, the finger creepers are what happens when that process doesn't finish. They're left over, discarded, and the game just lets them scuttle around caves, mostly annoying, mostly harmless in small numbers, never once stopping to acknowledge what they actually represent. That's the thing about a failed creation story. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody in the lands between brings up the finger creepers in dialogue. No NPC mourns them or explains them or even seems to notice they exist as anything other than pest enemies. They're just there, an open secret about the messiness of divine creation that the story never asks you to reckon with directly, because reckoning with it would mean admitting the two fingers process isn't clean, isn't controlled, and produces waste. Waste that can still move. Waste that still, in some small broken way, wants something. There's a detail in their placement that reinforces this reading, and it's easy to miss if you're only ever fighting through caves as fast as possible to get to the next landmark. Finger creepers don't show up scattered evenly across the world the way a lot of other enemy types do. They cluster. Specifically, they cluster in spaces that already carry some connection, however oblique, to the two fingers or to the sites where tarnished are processed and empowered. That's not the kind of thing a random loot table produces. That's deliberate encounter design, which means someone on the development side made a conscious choice to keep these failed vessels physically tethered to the machinery that failed to produce them properly. They're not just left over. They're left over in the specific rooms where the process that discarded them still, in some sense, continues to run. From something that was meant to be divine and failed, we move to something that might not have started as a creature at all. The worm faces. These show up later in a playthrough, usually in areas already saturated with unease, and visually they're some of the most straightforwardly disgusting things From Software has ever put in a game. A humanoid body, twisted into something not quite upright, with a face that's been replaced or overtaken by a mass of writhing worm-like tendrils. They spit projectiles. They're aggressive, and on a purely gameplay level, they're just another enemy type to manage. But the placement and the implication behind them is where things get uncomfortable. The dominant theory, pieced together from a scattering of item text and some very careful reading of where these things actually appear in the world, is that worm faces aren't a species. They're a condition, a state that something else, likely something that was once ordinary flesh, was reduced to through prolonged exposure to specific corrupting forces tied to certain outer god influences present in the setting. In other words, a worm face used to be something. A person, an animal, some other creature entirely. And what you're fighting is what's left after whatever it used to be got overwritten. This lines up with a broader pattern the game uses again and again without ever stating it plainly. Transformation as violence. Not transformation as growth, not transformation as evolution, but transformation as erasure. Something is taken and something else is put in its place, and the horror isn't the resulting monster. The horror is the fact that you cannot know, looking at a worm face, what it used to be. There's no tell, no lingering feature that says this one was a soldier, this one was a farmer, this one was somebody's father. The overwrite is total, and the game's refusal to give you that information isn't a gap in the writing, it's the point. You're meant to feel the absence of an answer as its own kind of dread. What makes the worm faces land harder than a lot of the game's other corrupted enemy types is the specific texture of the transformation. The way the writhing mass doesn't just cover the face but seems to have replaced whatever sensory organs used to be there. No eyes left to look back at you. No mouth left to speak, only to spit. It's a design choice that strips away the last thing a player instinctively looks for when trying to find some shred of the person a monster used to be, which is the face. Most transformation horror in games still leaves you a face to read, something to project humanity onto even as the rest of the body twists into something else. The worm faces take that away first. Whatever happened to them didn't start at the edges and work inward. It started exactly where you'd look for recognition, and it started there on purpose. Before we move on, it's worth sitting with one more variant of corruption that works differently from the worm faces, because the game is careful to distinguish between different kinds of overwrite, even when it never explains the distinction out loud. Anywhere you encounter enemies touched by the frenzied flame, you're looking at something with a different underlying logic than rot or divine failure. The eyes are the tell. Wide, unblinking, burning from within in a way that reads less like injury and more like possession. These aren't bodies that decayed or were denied their death. They're bodies that were in some sense volunteered. The lore around the frenzied flame frames it as a force that offers something in exchange for submission, an end to the cycle of death and rebirth that governs the rest of the setting, in return for total consumption by fire and madness. What makes the enemies afflicted by it more disturbing than a simple corrupted monster archetype is that implication of consent buried underneath the horror. Nobody did this to them the way the Golden Order did something to Godwin, or the way whatever force created the worm faces did something to its victims without asking. Somewhere, at some point, something in these people said yes, wanted this, reached for the flame because everything else on offer in this world was worse. That reframes the horror entirely. You're not looking at a victim. You're looking at someone who found a promise worth burning their entire identity down for, and the game never gives you enough information to know whether they were right to. It's worth pausing here to notice something structural about how these four creatures relate to each other, because it's not an accident. Godwin is a body that kept living after death and was repurposed by a higher power. The finger creepers are failed attempts at divine elevation, an incomplete process left to wander. The worm faces are ordinary flesh overwritten by outside corruption. The frenzied flame's victims are bodies that, in some twisted sense, chose their own consumption. 4 different mechanisms, 4 different scales, but the same underlying anxiety running through all of them. The fear of your body no longer being fully yours. Of something else deciding what you become, whether through force or through a promise too tempting to refuse, without anyone ever being required to account for it afterward. That anxiety gets pushed even further once you start looking at where these transformations tend to cluster geographically, because the game is not subtle about which regions it considers cursed on a structural level, even if it never says the word cursed out loud. And there's no better example of that than Caelid. If you've played the game even casually, you know Caelid by feel before you know it by name. The sky changes, the music changes. Everything is the wrong color, this deep, sick red that makes the whole region look like it's been dipped in something. And the wildlife reflects it. Caelid's animals aren't just aggressive, they're wrong in a specific, consistent way that the rest of the game's wildlife isn't. Bloated, distended, moving like something that shouldn't still be capable of movement. The lore reason for this is the Scarlet rot, a plague that's consumed the region so completely that it stopped functioning like a normal disease and started functioning more like an ecosystem in its own right. But here's the detail that turns Caelid from unpleasant into genuinely disturbing once you actually think it through. The rot doesn't kill quickly. It's not efficient. It's not merciful. What it does, over time to the creatures unlucky enough to live in its range is keep them alive far longer than they should be, in a state of ongoing decay, unable to actually finish dying. Think about what that means for the animals you're fighting in that region. They're not undead in the classic sense, animated corpses with no interior experience left. There's a strong implication, backed up by item-flavored text, and the general behavior of rot-afflicted creatures across the rest of the game, that these things are still, on some level, alive, still suffering, still trapped inside a body that's failing by inches instead of all at once. You're not putting down monsters when you fight through Caelid. You're mercy-killing things that have been denied the mercy of an actual death for what could be years, and the game never once frames it that way explicitly, because framing it that way would mean asking you to feel something uncomfortable every time you clear out a pack of rot dogs for crafting materials. There's also the question of how Caelid got this way in the first place, which the game answers only obliquely, through implication rather than statement. The region wasn't always like this. It became like this, through the actions of a specific demigod, whose own affliction with the rot spread outward from a central point until it consumed everything around it. That means every suffering animal you encounter in that red wasteland is, in a sense, collateral. None of them chose this. None of them did anything to deserve a slow, decades-long dissolution. They were simply unlucky enough to live somewhere that one person's personal catastrophe eventually swallowed whole, and the game lets you walk through the wreckage of that catastrophe without ever once stopping to make you reckon with whose fault it actually was. That's the quiet cruelty buried in Caelid's design. It's not scary because of jump scares or aggressive enemy density, although it has both. It's scary because once you understand what the Scarlet rot actually does to a body over time, you start to realize that every enemy encounter in that region is potentially an act of kindness you're performing, without meaning to, on creatures too far gone to know the difference, in a land nobody bothered to put out of its misery until you wandered through with a sword. Let's shift gears slightly, because not everything on this list needs a body count or a plague to be unsettling. Some of the Lands Between's most quietly disturbing residents are things you'd walk past without a second thought if you weren't paying attention. The plant-adjacent enemies, and specifically the ones the community's taken to calling saplings, or occasionally Miranda flowers depending on which specific variant you're talking about. At a glance, these read as simple environmental hazards, a patch of oddly colored flora that throws projectiles or grabs at you if you get too close. Standard video game plant enemy stuff, the kind of thing you'd find in dozens of other titles without a second thought. What sets the Lands Between's version apart, and what makes it worth including here, is the ambiguity around what these things actually are underneath the plant matter. Because the game gives you just enough visual and textual information to suspect they're not purely vegetal at all. Several variants, when you look closely or when you manage to catch them mid-animation in a way the game clearly wasn't expecting you to scrutinize, show hints of something skeletal or humanoid buried inside the mass of growth. Not always. Not consistently enough to build an ironclad case, but enough across enough different encounters that the pattern feels intentional rather than incidental. The working theory is that these aren't plants that happen to look vaguely corpse-shaped. They're corpses that plants have grown through, around, and eventually replaced, using the body as a kind of scaffold the way ivy uses a fence. If that's accurate, and the visual evidence leans pretty strongly in that direction, then what you're actually looking at is a body reclaimed by the land itself. Not through decay in the traditional sense, not through rot, but through the same slow, patient, indifferent process by which nature erases anything left too long in one place. There's no malice in it. No divine punishment. No corrupting outer god, nothing with intention behind it at all, just time, and weather, and roots finding the path of least resistance through what used to be a person. That absence of malice is, in its own way, worse than the alternative. At least the worm faces imply somebody did this on purpose. The saplings imply nobody did anything. The world just kept going, the way it always does, with or without you in it. There's something worth noting about where these plant enemies tend to grow too, because it isn't random. They cluster around sites that already carry weight in the world, old battlefields, forgotten graves, places where the density of bodies left unburied over the course of the setting's many wars would have been highest. That placement makes the theory hold together a little more tightly. These aren't just plants that happen to grow somewhere corpse adjacent. They're plants that grew specifically in the places where corpses were most likely to be left where they fell, which suggests the process isn't rare or isolated. It's just what happens, eventually, to anyone left unburied long enough in a world this old. The saplings aren't an aberration. They might be the default outcome for most of the dead the story never bothers to individually account for. We've spent a lot of time on things that used to be something else. Let's close out with a broader category, because not every unsettling resident of the lands between fits neatly into a transformation narrative. Some of them are just wrong on a structural level, and the game seems to know it, based on how carefully it tends to bury them. The lands between has an enormous amount of background wildlife that most players never think twice about. Deer, wolves, birds, the occasional oversized insect skittering through the underbrush. Most of it exists purely for atmosphere or for the small crafting materials it drops, and most of it is entirely unremarkable. But scattered throughout that wildlife are a handful of species that don't behave like the rest, that don't fit the ecological logic the rest of the world seems to follow, and that the game never bothers to explain even in the scattered, oblique way it explains everything else on this list. There are creatures tucked into specific, out-of-the-way corners of the map that appear nowhere else, that have no clear evolutionary relationship to anything else you encounter, and that exist in numbers so small it's genuinely unclear whether you're looking at a species or a single unique specimen that got placed there once and never repeated. No item text, no dialogue reference, no quest tied to their existence, just a thing, sitting in a corner of the world doing whatever it does, waiting for a player curious enough or lost enough to actually stumble across it. Catalogers of the game's wildlife, and there are dedicated communities that have spent years doing exactly that kind of cataloging, have noted something odd about how these species distribute across the map once you actually chart them. They don't cluster around danger. The way you'd expect a designer to place rare creatures as a reward for braving a difficult area. Some of the strangest, most anomalous wildlife in the entire game sits in places that are otherwise completely mundane. Open fields, unremarkable stretches of coastline, spots you'd walk straight through without a second thought if your horse wasn't briefly startled by something moving at the edge of your vision. That placement logic, or lack of one, is its own kind of unsettling. It suggests the world wasn't built entirely around what the player is meant to notice. Some of it was just built. The way a real landscape has things living in it that no one intended you to find, because finding them was never the point. This is where the horror stops being about transformation or corruption or rot, and starts being about scale, about the sheer size of the world From Software built, and the quiet acknowledgement, buried in design choices nobody was required to make, that most of it will never be fully explained to you, not because the explanation doesn't exist somewhere in a design document, but because the game has decided you don't get to have it. You get the creature. You get the discomfort of not knowing what it is or why it's there. And that's the whole experience. No closure. No paragraph of item flavor text tying it back into the wider mythology. Just a thing in the dark that exists, apparently, for its own sake, indifferent to whether you ever find it at all. There's a related thread worth pulling before we move on, because it circles back to something we touched on with Godwin and gives it an even stranger shape. Miquella, another of the demigod siblings, undergoes a transformation of his own over the course of the story, one bound up with the rot that ravaged Caelid, and with a specific, deliberate act of self-alteration that separates him from every other transformed figure on this list. Where Godwin's change was done to him, and where the Wormface's change was inflicted from outside, Miquella's is chosen. Engineered, pursued with a level of intent that makes it read less like corruption and more like a project. Carried out over years, aimed at a specific outcome he believed was worth any cost to reach. The specifics of what that project actually does to him are, predictably, never stated outright. What the game gives you instead is a body of evidence spread across item descriptions, environmental storytelling, and the regions tied to him, and the behavior of those closest to him, all pointing toward a transformation that trades away something essential about who he was in exchange for power he judged necessary. The horror here isn't the transformation itself. Plenty of characters in this setting change forms for plenty of reasons. The horror is the deliberateness of it, the fact that unlike Godwin or the Wormfaces or the Saplings, nobody did this to Miquella. He built it himself, piece by piece, apparently convinced the version of himself he was discarding was an acceptable price for the version he was trying to become. That's a different flavor of dread than anything else on this list. It's not the fear of losing yourself to something outside your control. It's the fear of choosing to lose yourself, and being confident enough in the choice to see it through to the end. That thread connects in turn to a smaller but no less unsettling detail, buried in the specific botany of the Miranda flower family, the broader group the earlier sapling variants technically belong to. Not every member of that family follows the corpse scaffold pattern we already covered. Some of the rarer variants, tucked into specific regions with their own distinct color palettes and threat profiles, show behavior that suggests something closer to responsiveness than simple aggression. They react to proximity in ways that read, if you're paying close attention across enough encounters, less like a plant's automatic defensive reflex, and more like a plant that is, in some limited sense, registering what's approaching it before it decides how to react. That's a much smaller claim than anything we've made so far, and it's worth treating it with the caution it deserves. There's no item text confirming anything like awareness in the Lands Between's plant life, but the behavioral pattern is consistent enough. Across enough separate encounters with the rarer variants, that a meaningful portion of the community studying this stuff has started asking the question seriously instead of dismissing it outright. If even a fraction of the Miranda flower family retains some trace of responsiveness from whatever body it grew through, then the earlier theory about saplings reclaiming the unburied dead gets a much darker addendum. It's not just that the land grows through you after you die. It's that some small, buried part of what you were might still be registering the world going by from somewhere it can no longer leave. That indifference might be the single most consistent thread running through everything we've covered tonight, and it's worth sitting with before we wrap up. Godwin's transformation isn't explained to you directly. The Finger Creeper's failure is never mourned. The Wormface's original identities are erased without comment. The Frenzied Flame's victims are never asked whether the bargain was worth it. Caelid's suffering wildlife is never framed as suffering. The sapling's slow reclamation of the dead happens without any narrator stepping in to tell you how to feel about it. Miquella's deliberate self-erasure is treated as a footnote to a larger political story rather than the horror it actually is. And the unexplained background creatures tucked into the world's corners simply exist, without justification, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the story ever stopping to ask what they are. That's not a writing oversight. It's a philosophy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in the rest of the game either. The Lands Between is not a world built to explain itself to you. It's a world that happened, that's still happening, whether or not anyone is paying attention, whether or not anyone survives long enough to understand what they're looking at. The horror isn't in any single creature on this list. It's in the accumulated weight of all of them existing simultaneously, unremarked upon, in a world that has clearly decided most of its own history is not owed to the people wandering through it. That's what separates this kind of horror from the jump scare boss health bar variety the marketing tends to lean on. There's no music sting when you realize what Godwin actually is. No cutscene when you finally connect the Finger Creepers to their failed purpose. The realization happens quietly, usually alone, usually well after you've already moved on to the next region, when some unrelated piece of item text or NPC dialogue suddenly clicks into place with something you saw 20 hours earlier and thought nothing of at the time. That delayed horror, the kind that ambushes you retroactively instead of in the moment, is harder to shake than anything a boss fight can throw at you, because you can't out-level it, you can't out-gear it, you just have to sit with it. And maybe that's the actual point of building a world this unwilling to explain itself. Not to frustrate you, not to gatekeep the lore behind item description archaeology for its own sake, but to recreate, in however small a way a video game can, the actual experience of encountering something ancient and half understood, and realizing that most of what happened to it will never be recovered. That's not a flaw in the design, it's the entire design. The Lands Between doesn't owe you an ending to every thread it introduces, and the fact that it doesn't give you one is precisely what makes so much of it linger long after you've put the controller down.